I want you to know I did turn it off. I'll just stick it here, so I think in my pocket it came back on. I want to thank two people, Dave Burns and Lou Claudo. Did I spell that right? Did I say that right? Yeah, back there. I've had a long correspondence with Lou over common interests, and he told me about your association and more or less got us linked up. So, and I met so many neat people this evening at dinner. And I want to bring to you a message from the 16th century. I'm not an archaeologist, so I'm sorry I don't have a dig to show you. Artifacts to examine, both genuine and fake. I'm a historian and I work in documents. And for the last 15 years or so, I've been working on a biography of a priest I'm going to tell you about tonight. Some of you may have heard of him, and perhaps you haven't. And I think you'll find him to be one of the most interesting figures in the history of the conquest of the Americas, because he represented the other side of the conquest. So, and I've put this together. I teach, and so I've more or less been keeping up with technology as it kind of revolutionizes the classroom, and I bought into the PowerPoint kind of genre years ago. So you're going to see a PowerPoint presentation tonight to be distracted by images as we talk about more serious things. Now, this first slide shows you a man that you're very well acquainted with, doesn't it? Juan Ponce de Leon. And Juan Ponce de Leon, more or less, is the face of the conquest in the early 16th century. He came over here, as all Floridians know, searching for the fountain of youth, which he didn't find. He wasn't really looking for the fountain of youth, and here's where the historian in me comes up to the front. We like to revise things. He was looking for Indian slaves to make up for the declining population that was basically occurring across the islands of Cuba and Hispaniola. And, but he has been edified and lifted up as the man who discovered Florida. And so next year we're having a big celebration, the 500th anniversary of the discovery of North America by a Spaniard, Juan Ponce de Leon. So I just throw him in there to give you the traditional face of the conquistador. I'm not going to run down Juan Ponce de Leon because I'd be running down a person who is looked upon as a kind of a forerunner of the European presence in North America. And there were some obviously positive elements to it, but you're not going to hear them tonight. Now, earlier on the island of Hispaniola, you're going to see a little bit about the life. This is not showing everything, but it's showing enough. The life of Bartolomé de las Casas. Why is that not coming up? What do I need to do to make this whole slideshow? There's supposed to be an image with that slide. But that's okay. I can drive this thing without images. I'll keep track with the images. There's supposed to be another image there, which is from a stamp that was put out by the country of Mexico a few years ago, about a man who was called the protector of American Indians. And that's what I'm going to focus on tonight. He arrived in the New World in 1502. He came as a young man. And what he witnessed in the early presence of the Spanish on the Greater Antilles, in the islands, the large islands, you know, the Greater Antilles being Hispaniola, Cuba, Haiti, well, Cuba and Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. But the first conquest began on the island of Hispaniola. And what he witnessed became the source of what was called the Black Legend. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Black Legend. Actually, it's illustrated here. This is going to be one of these days that me and technology don't get along. Okay, the administration of all major universities in this country has talked us into the technology, buy into the revolution, and then it fails on us. But in the brief history of the destruction of the Indians, which was a book that he wrote, and we'll talk a little bit about this book, he described what in fact happened between Spaniards and Native Americans in the early 16th century, specifically between 1502 and 1511 when he was on the island of Hispaniola. You can read it as well as I can, and you're probably reading it now while I'm talking over it. And I'm not going to read this, but I'll give you another maybe 30 seconds or so. You can see that this description of the early contact between the Taino Indians, the Taino Indian culture, an early village culture of the island of Hispaniola and the Spanish was horrible from the perspective of the Taino Indians. And we're going to take a look a little bit at this, and you can read from the book and from the record that Las Casas made as he witnessed with his own eyes what the Spanish did to the Taínos. And historians, we have our own kind of basis for validity, and we like to go, and our basis is, and the archaeologists have their own, you know, how they test the probity and the truth of materials. Ours is to go back to the original documents. Go back as far as we can in whatever it is that we're studying and get as close to those documents written by the people who lived and saw whatever it is they're writing about. Now, they could be liars. You know, you have to discern what is right and wrong between, well, about what was said, but nonetheless, going back to the original. And Las Casas is one of the original authors. Now, I threw this side in as well. As the conquest proceeded in Mexico, I mean in the islands of the Caribbean, and then it spread to the Mexican, the North American continent, Mexico being part of the North American continent, 1519, 1520. And some of you are very familiar, some of you may not be familiar with the conquest of Mexico. I'm just going to hit on it briefly here. It was a conquest led by a man named Hernan Cortés, who left from Cuba, and in the space of 2.5 years overwhelmed the Nahua, which is kind of a contemporary modern way of speaking of the Aztec civilization of Mexico. And so we see this happening across the world that the Spanish had discovered. There was a slide there of, and there's a picture of Francisco Pizarro in Peru, but it's not going to come up. But the same thing happened in Mexico. The conquest of Peru was led by Francisco Pizarro, and Pizarro conquered the Incas in the space of 2.5 to 3 years. He subdued the Inca Empire, and you can read a very kind of vivid description of the early battle between Pizarro and the Inca Emperor Atahualpa and his army, which was camped, if you know Peru, in the northern Peruvian city of Cajamarca in 1532. So, and I throw these in there just so you can get an idea of what was going on. Again, there's a beautiful image on the left of which you can enjoy. And it shows very graphically, it's a painting of the Spanish encounter with the Inca people in the town of Cajamarca on the central square. Okay, so we'll leave Pizarro aside here for a while, and we will turn to Las Casas again. Now, Las Casas later became a priest, and later he became a Dominican friar, and between 1511 and 1514, he marched with Pánfilo de Narváez into the conquest of Peru. But you can see his dilemma here, which I've described in this book, and then another one that I'm just finishing right now, that his problem was that, let's put it in a nutshell, what he was seeing with his eyes and what he was witnessing with his eyes and his ears and his heart and his mind was so contrary to what he was supposed to be practicing as a Christian priest that it began to divide his soul into two parts. How was he going to reconcile being a Christian priest and later on a Dominican friar? He becomes a Dominican friar in 1522. How is he going to reconcile the scripture that he's reading with the reality of the conquest? And that was a dynamic tension in his life that drove him, okay? So let me just see which slide here, because I was kind of looking at what it's supposed to look like, but I'm not going to look at that because you can't see them. And in his life, he became eventually designated by the Cardinal of Spain at the time, Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, as the universal protector of American Indians. And so I think of Las Casas as the quintessential anti-conquistador. If Juan Ponce de Leon and Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro and our friend Hernán de Soto, who came through Alabama, my part of the world, if they were the conquistadors, the opposite side of the conquistadors, a very small group of people, but with a very powerful voice, Dominican friars and Franciscan friars represented a contrary view of what was happening. So that's what attracted me back to Las Casas. He underwent an epiphany of sorts in 1514 on the island of Cuba. He witnessed a massacre, and Louise has been suffering with me as I read the page proofs to this full biography that was about to be published by Cambridge this year. And I just reread the whole section on the massacre of a group of Arawak Indians in the town of Caonao in Cuba in 1514. And that brought Las Casas to what I consider to be his epiphany, or if you want to call it his, if you're into the Christian religion and the history of the Christian church, which I teach, it was his Paul on the road to Damascus moment, in which Paul, the Apostle Paul, as many of you know, undergoes a radical transformation when he's knocked off a horse and knocked blind, and he turns from being a persecutor of Christians to a defender of the faith. So I had thrown this in. There's Hernando de Soto, the face of the typical conquistador, who came through here, didn't he? Yeah, he landed a little bit south of here, somewhere, right? Somewhere in Tampa Bay, and then he took off on his streak through 10 southern states, southeastern states, on an expedition of exploitation, an expedition of greed, and an expedition that marked basically the end of Indian, or the society of the Indian peoples that existed at the time, what you anthropologists and archaeologists call the Mississippian or woodlands culture. It basically started to end with the march of De Soto through this part of the world because of the introduction of diseases. So, Las Casas, returning to Las Casas. Okay, he writes a book called The Brief History of the Destruction of the Indies. And in this book, he satinizes the conquest and the conquistadors, and he depicts and what he does is interesting, and this is part of his flaw. He was a flawed figure, like all of us are, right? In his defense of the American Indians, he ran down his own race, the Spanish. He said they were vicious and cruel, mean, barbaric, and they were uniquely so. And it made great stuff for the Protestant competitors, for the heart and the soul of Europe in the 16th century when the Reformation was underway, because here was a Spaniard describing the Spanish Catholics just the way the new Protestants figured they were. Retrograde, intolerant, the Spanish Inquisition, burning people. The Protestants burned the Spanish too, and other Catholics. What happened in the Christian church in the 16th, 17th century, sometimes amazing. But what Las Casas does in his defense of the Indians, he runs down the Spanish, and he's accused of being basically a traitor to his race. So, but he's also, I'm going to tell you about a phase of him that I think answers the question of why he behaved exactly the way he behaved. He fulfilled another role, and we'll get back to it in a second. I finally found a slide here that shows a little bit of the Black Legend, the graphic depiction of the Black Legend in the making. And this was a slide. This was a painting done in the late 1580s, early 1590s by a Flemish woodcutter and painting named Theodore de Brie, and it really catches so well, graphically, what was happening between the Spanish and the Indians. Not all the Spanish were like this. Let me, I'm a Hispanic by demographics, so my mother was Chilean, so I've got a little bit of that Spanish blood running through me myself. They didn't all behave this way. But there was enough of this behavior, and you can see it there, in which you sicked your dogs on innocent people, in which you established your authority over them by calculated terrorism. And you did things to people that is hard to believe people could do to other people. I've had that reaction myself as I read through the elements. And Las Casas recorded it all in a long history, 3 volumes, but then he synthesized it into a small history called The Brief History of the Destruction of the Indies, which he published in 1552. And it was his attempt to lift up the conscience of the Spanish. Look what you're doing. Look what you've done to these people. One, you have not given them what they need, which is the Christian word, so they may have salvation. And 2, you condemned yourself to hell by doing it. And that was his message over 50 or 60 years, because he lived a long life. Many of his enemies thought that was diabolical because he did. Now, let me turn to an element of his life that I think answers the question as why he was so driven and so focused. I think he was a prophet. And I don't know what kind of definition, you have a prophet. If you're like me, you go to Google, Wikipedia, and quickly Google it and find out, well, what is the formula? Or maybe if you're really into integrity, you go to Webster's online. That's better than Google or Wikipedia, But anyhow, what is a prophet? There was a prophetic nature in him, in Las Casas. He was not a priest who was not uneducated, like so many priests who the Reformation was aimed at, an uneducated, worldly, the things that led to the Protestant Reformation. He was well educated. He read Latin and wrote in Latin as a young man and learned Spanish, studied a little Greek, and read compulsively across the great writers of the ancient world, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. He loved the Romans, Cicero, Seneca, and others, and he read deeply in Scripture. He was not a word pastor of the 21st century, but he was close to it because he founded his criticism and his philosophy and the foundations of it ethically and morally and theologically were founded on Scripture. And I think he fit into the role of prophet. And you know the prophets from the Old Testament. You've heard of them. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, Amos, and others. And they periodically arose in the life of the Israelites. Go back to the Old Testament, and they fulfilled 2 roles, basically, prophets, right? Well, you've already read this already because you're ahead of me. 1, they told the truth. Nobody likes a prophet, by the way. I read a paper on him a year or 2 ago on why nobody liked Bartholomew de las Casas, because he spoke the truth. And oftentimes the truth, the unvarnished truth, hurt. So they spoke the truth, and he spoke the truth, at least the way he saw it, all right? And it was often unwanted by the kings and the rulers in the Old Testament. And 2, they predicted the future. What's going to happen? And like Isaiah in the next slide. So what exactly does a prophet do? Okay, in the book of Daniel, again, the historian going back to the documents. What does Daniel say? He says, and this is the way I think Las Casas saw himself. I prayed to the Lord my God and confessed, Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, we have sinned. All right? We have sinned and done wrong. And Las Casas was the type of guy who would go, if you don't know that you sinned, let me tell you how you sinned. Nobody likes a prophet. We have been wicked and have rebelled. We have turned away from your commands and laws. And we have not listened to your servants, the prophets, right here, prophets, I'm telling you, who spoke in the name to our kings, our princes, our ancestors, and to all the people of the land. So I think he fulfilled a prophetic role. And they're not always welcome. The king of Israel answered Jehoshaphat, and this is from 2 Chronicles, 18:7, you can read that. There is still one man through, and I love this, there's humor in the Bible, you know. There is still one man through whom we can inquire of the Lord, because they were trying to divine some omen or some vision. But I hate him because he never prophesies any good about me. This is the king talking. But always bad. He is Micah, son of Imlah. You know, the guy's always right, but it's never good. So do we call him or not? But Micah said, as surely as the Lord lives, I can tell him only what my God says. And that's what Las Casas did. You don't want to hear this. You don't want to hear that you have committed pecados, sins against the Lord by not Christianizing these people, by brutally treating them the way you do. Are they not rational men? And there was a famous sermon made by a Dominican friar, Antonio de Montesinos. It's the most famous sermon ever preached in the Western Hemisphere, and it wasn't preached by Jonathan Edwards or Billy Graham, as much as I admire Billy Graham and Jonathan and other great Protestant preachers. It was preached by Antonio de Montesinos in 1511 on the third Sunday of Advent, in which he stood up in a little bitty church in Santo Domingo, and he told the Spaniards the truth. Are they not men? Are they not rational individuals? Don't they deserve something better than to be treated like dogs? You even call them dogs. It was okay to call a Moor a dog in Spain. Moors, Muslims, and Christians had been fighting each other for 500 years. And the word dog almost just rolled off naturally. It's kind of like the one word that we use in the South that seems to be two words, but it's only one word. And this belongs really to my father's generation, damn Yankee. Was there anything other? My father was born and bred in the South. Okay. And my family, my southern family, because my other family is way south down in Chile, but my South Carolina family never really forgave, salud, my father and mother for allowing me to be born in New Jersey. Which was a cross I carried for a long time until I discovered who won the Civil War. Okay. Now, if you prefer the New Testament, your prophets in the New Testament, above all, you must understand that no prophecy of Scripture came about by the prophet's own interpretation. Now, this is talking about John. For prophecy never had its origin in the will of man, but men spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. So he saw himself as the voice of maybe not God specifically, or Jesus, exactly, but when Las Casas did condemn the Spanish, he did it on a scriptural basis. Now, he used other sources because he could bombard people with his erudition. He'd call out St. Thomas Aquinas, natural law, canon law, medieval law, the ancients. He turned Socrates or Aristotle on his head, but basically he would come back and use Scripture. By the way, he was a contemporary of a man whose calling card in the early 16th century was sola scriptura. 1485, they were both born, Martin Luther and Bartholomew de las Casas. And Martin Luther and Bartholomew de las Casas, Martin Luther, the reformer, the radical, and Las Casas, the very firm Catholic, actually had a lot in common in the way they championed the liberty of people to make choices. But they didn't get too close. This was not a time to get chummy with the enemy. And here I just saw this slide. I'm glad some of the images are coming through. They're kind of frivolous at this stage. I didn't read this. This was just something I saw, a good one, picture of Isaiah or a painting of Isaiah. I like Isaiah. He's not a person to be fooled with. That kind of look is enough to nail anybody. And there's Las Casas. This is the only painting of him that is genuine, that we know we know almost positively, and I say 99% that it's him in probably done in the 1560s. That little part on the bottom is erroneous. We've established that this particular painter didn't paint it 1560s, but you can see in that kind of craggy image experience, honesty, a kind of a judicial authority to make decisions. And that particular copy of a book was one he wrote in 1516, in which he brought things into play. So his message was stop the sinning. If we have established that prophets told the truth and they called people back to God and were not very popular, when we examine Las Casas' life, it almost perfectly fits the prophetic model, if there is such an animal. And of course, historians have developed a kind of X-ray of what a prophet should be like. And I borrowed this from Stafford Poole, a friend of mine. He's a Catholic priest and a member of an order. And he wrote a brilliant little paper that he presented at the University of Florida back in the 1990s, never published it. but it's a taxonomy of the prophet. What is it about a prophet that identifies a person as a prophet? And he wrote the paper not simply about religious prophets, but about secular prophets. You have to read the little paper. If you want to sometime, I'll leave my email and you can get in touch with me and I'll send you a copy of it. But he listed about 6 or 7 characteristics of a prophet. You have the call. And the reason I was interested in this because Las Casas fit them all. And Stafford Poole was one of the great Las Casistas of the 20th century. He's translated quite a few of his works from Latin into Spanish and English. So he knew of Las Casas well. He said there's a compulsion, and there's no doubt about it. The man was obsessive compulsive. There's an idea fixe, kind of a French word, makes it look a little more academic, but the fixed idea, the focus, the total focus. No compromise or gradualism. It's like the abolition of slavery in the 19th century. Some countries tried to do it slowly and gradually, and it never worked. Because finally, when the West finally decided that this was not something that was morally right or economically worthwhile having, they finally, most countries got rid of it in one fell swoop. But he said you can't go about easily diminishing what you've done to the Indians. You have to recognize your error and then correct it. Exaggeration and symbolism, yes, Las Casas was a terrible exaggerator. He exaggerated the sins of his opponents. He invented figures when he didn't have enough at hand, and that there was a failure in him as a human being. The possibility of neuroses. One of his biographers in Spanish, Pedro Menendez Pidal, wrote a book in which he just nailed Las Casas for being a neurotic, psychotic, crazy, wild, obsessive individual who was a traitor to his race and who didn't have any sense of balance when it came to making judgments on men and what they do. And Menendez Pidal, in some instances, I think, probably has some validity. And rejection. He was rejected. But he had the conscience of the king. If you're going to be rejected, make sure you have friends in high places. Not elected friends, because they can be replaced, but in a monarchy, he got into the conscience of the young Charles I, who was born in 1500. It's always easy to figure what Charles's age was at any time in the 16th century. And he laid out before Charles in a committee forum that had been called by Charles to discuss what was happening in the Indies. And he laid it out for Charles, and Charles listened. Charles was not a trained ecclesiastic. He was not a theologian. He wasn't an intellectual, but he was a good student. And one of his professors was Erasmus of Rotterdam, one of the great humanists of the time. And Las Casas got into him. And Charles never turned on Las Casas. He didn't do everything Las Casas wanted him to do because it was simply impossible, because Charles lived in the real world. But he always had the friendship of powerful people. So moving along close to the end here, Las Casas moved into the role, and he witnessed this massacre in 1514. I think that's what changed him, and I call that his epiphany, but it's also similar to his Paul on the road to Damascus experience, I think. I like that last sentence. I don't know if I wrote it. I probably borrowed it from somebody because it reads so well. Unlike Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Jonah, who felt initially inadequate to the task, and if you go back in the Old Testament and read, every prophet who was called told God, I'm sorry, I'm busy, or I can't do it, or Moses, I can't speak publicly, or I've got other things to do, or I'm inadequate, please go down and pick on somebody else. Las Casas answered the call and says, I can do it. And it reminds me a little bit, of some of the Old Testament characters who said, yeah, call on me, I can do it. And he never doubted his calling or his ability to shake and move the world by the truth of his message, because he figured he had the truth. So, the location of Now, this is a nice map. Can you see it all? Good. That's Cuba. It's really a very nice map of Cuba, and it shows you the location of the riverbed where the slaughter occurred in 1514 that turned Las Casas. I'm glad you enjoyed that map. Actually, I had two maps, a modern map and the other map. So, coming to the end of this little presentation, because obviously could go on forever, and I'm not. I've deliberately omitted most of the examples which demonstrate how Las Casas was prophetic, from his call to his rejection by authority, his inability to compromise or to accept gradualism, his gross exaggeration. He lied in many instances to make his points. He defended, for example, human sacrifices of the Indians because he thought that somehow or another that confirmed that they had a higher conscience and recognized that there were gods and they were sacrificing them, the dearest thing they had, and therefore that could be not accepted, but it could be understood. Even his friends blanched at that. Okay, you're over the top, Bartolome. So a quick scan of his life finds lots of examples. You can find examples in this little book, 1995, not 20. And again, this is a wonderful slide. You can see that of the document on the left, which show typical historians like to show documents from the period of how hard it is to read. And look what we do. We read this stuff. I probably couldn't read it now. It's been years since I got into it. So today, this slide and one more, and then I'll turn it over and let you ask questions if you like. When I was working on the longer book, I realized that I had been following Las Casas' life physically for 10 or 15 years, and I've dragged Louise into some of these places. She's a terrible third world traveler. She would never make it as the wife of an archaeologist, who goes off into remote parts with his tent, quite happy to live, right next to the ground and to the people. And some of my best friends are archaeologists. But so I took her off to Costa Rica and to Nicaragua. Well, I don't know, he didn't go to Nicaragua. We went to Santo Domingo. I traveled over a lot of the places that he saw and he worked in, simply to get a feel for his legacy today. And his legacy in Latin America is still very much there. You can't go to Mexico today, ask a kid if they've ever heard of Bartolome Las Casas, and they go, sí. They may not know anything about it, but they've heard about him. It's like some of my students. Not Robert E. Lee, okay? Maybe Ulysses S. Grant in Alabama. And he is, there's a statue to him in the city of Trinidad on the southern coast of Cuba. And I love this statue because it's imagined, but there he is, the father and the protector looking after his sheep. And he uses the image of the Indians as sheep, or the Amerindians, if you're really PC, or the particular tribe of people, the sheep. And he uses another image, the Spanish, as the wolves. And of course the shepherd is Jesus, and he sees himself doing the same thing, taking care of these poor sheep. So at the end, I come to the conclusion that he was an extraordinary individual. Some people in the 16th century feared him. Most loathed him, but few ignored him, because as one contemporary observer wrote in 1517, back to his superiors in Spain, he was a Hieronymite friar in Santo Domingo. He says, "Get this guy out of here. Everything he lights everything where he goes." And he wasn't talking about the light of truth, unless it's that truth that actually brings you to the reality of what some situation truly is. So this is a wonderful statue, again, by Constantino Brumidi. Since you don't see it, this is your excuse to go to Washington, go to the Capitol, and this statue of Las Casas was done by an Italian painter in the 19th century, and that's it. And this in fact, I'm not trying to peddle this thing. Dave or somebody says, "Yeah, bring some books down." This is the Brumidi painting in the Capitol building in Washington in the 19th century, when this country was looking for heroes and looking for historical depth to to push our history back simply beyond the revolution, push it back to Europe and the great actors in the 19th century. And that's when Christopher Columbus was elevated to such a high level, especially in the 400th anniversary in 1892. 100 years later, though everybody here has lived through the quincentennial, Christopher Columbus suffered a rather sharp fall from the heights he was held 100 years before. So that's what I have to you tonight, for you tonight, and I thought if there's any questions or comments, please. Abundant legislation was passed to recognize the liberty and the freedom that theoretically American Indians had, that they did in fact possess sovereignty and dominion over their own lives, and that some aspects of the Spanish invasion or the Spanish conquest, or if you want to kind of water it down, what's called today the great encounter between the European and the Spanish civilization, that much of it was wrong, that it was brutal. But in fact, Louise, you know, it recalls, and I'll answer the question this: why are laws oftentimes repeated and repeated and repeated? Good laws they may be. They're repeated largely because they're not obeyed. And what you're trying to do is bring people in line with law, as it were. So yes, he did have an effect. By the 1570s, for example, the Spanish crown said no more conquest. You can't have any more. If they are, and if there are going to be voyages or expeditions of discovery, they have to be for that. You have to recognize that these people cannot be enslaved. Indian slavery was abolished. Black slavery stayed in place, but Indian slavery was abolished in the 1540s. So yes, he did have an effect. It was small in some instances, but it was the voice of, it was a passionate voice of liberty and equality. And what I do bring out in another book is that he had a long-term effect on thinkers such as John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, because he early on championed in his writings that all men are the same. He wrote that. Todos hombres somos los mismos. And all men are the same comes to be associated with some of the great theories that underlay the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The question is about, there's a bishop, a Dominican bishop actually, like Las Casas, Diego de Landa, who was called back to Spain actually in the 1550s because he had so gone over the top in trying to exterminate and extirpate idolatry among the Maya. And part of the reason that he was called back was Las Casas thinking was percolating through the crown and saying this guy is doing things that are outrageous. So he was called back, and then he produced, based on his work with the Maya, the greatest tract on Mayan history, the Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán. But it was in 1562, and Las Casas died in 1566, so I don't know if they had much of a relationship. I didn't discover it. The Inquisition, you know, was established. Well, I don't know how much you know about the Inquisition. I don't know much about it either. But the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, was established to root out idolatry and root out heresy, and to ensure orthodoxy among the faithful. And it was largely established to ensure that Moors, Muslims in Spain, and Jews who had either converted willingly or had been forced into conversion after 1492 and 1502 conformed to the Christian faith. So the Inquisition was aimed at people who had heard the word and rejected it, or somehow or another continued to worship in a secret fashion. The Indians, on the other hand, had not heard the word. So how could they be subject to the Inquisition? And so the formal Inquisition, the autos de fe, the acts of faith, was not established until the late 1570s or 1580s. There were episcopal inquisitions in which bishops actually performed the acts of inquisition, but precisely because theoretically you can't punish somebody for a sin that they can't commit until they've heard the word. Well, he went on the entrada of Pamphilo de Narvaez, led by Governor Velázquez in 1511 into Cuba. Velázquez was a good friend of Las Casas. Las Casas held Indians in an institution called encomienda. Encomienda if I'm the Spaniard and you're the Indians and you're the leader of the expedition and I had participated in the subjugation of this island, you would commend these Indians to me to work in my service because I had performed good things for the crown and the king by subjugating the island and the people, and in return I was supposed to Christianize you. And the encomienda was violated all the time. And he was an encomendero. He held Indians encomienda. He marched with Velázquez into Cuba in 1511, and he was part of that expedition. And I think being part of that expedition, being so close to it, coming into contact with so many native peoples, Arawaks of Cuba, was really what brought him to the top and over the top. So he was involved in, and he also was involved in certain expeditions on the island of Española between 1504 and 1506, in which the Spanish, under Governor Nicolas de Ovando, crushed some Indian rebellions. And Las Casas was there. He says, and when he records some of the elements that go into the making of the book, the history of the destruction of the Indies, he often says, and I was there. And that I didn't mention this, but and I was there. That's a powerful tool to help persuade people back in Spain that he was right. He says, what have you done? You know, philosophically, theologically, you may be a giant in the field, you may be close to the crown, you may be rich, you may be famous, but I was there and I saw it. So he marched in some of part of the fascination of the world with the 500th anniversary of Columbus' discovery of the New World was a bunch of stuff that was just outrageous. You know, everybody was building boats and ships, and there must have been fleets of Niñas and Pintas and Santa Marias coming to the Atlantic, and all sorts of things. But some of it was very academic, and one of the things that his modern Dominican brothers determined to do in Spain was to put together an edition of his complete works. And this was published between 1988 and 1996 or 97. 14 volumes. I mean, they're book stops. They're door stops. They're 1,000 pages long. And it's virtually all of the important not all of the documentation. No historian will ever admit that all of the documentation has been discovered. You know, you always have some little recondite corner in some obscure archive in Bolivia that you need to send your graduate student to, or you need to go to. Of course, you know, somebody has to go to Seville and Madrid and do this. But those 14 volumes are, and they're called Las Obras Completas, Bartolomé de las Casas, Obras Completas, Bartolomé de las Casas, complete works. And it is a gold mine that few people have mined because it is hard to read through. I can tell you right now, I did not read all 14 volumes in Latin, and I just picked through the ones in Spanish because I follow the leads of others who have done this. But it is an immense source, and there are, and for anthropologists, I know you guys are interested in anthropology. I worked with Jim Knight at the University of Alabama. Jim is a good friend of mine, and he's written a lot about DeSoto, and he's a graduate of the Florida PhD program, a good man. And he and I have collaborated on, he does a lot of the archaeology, and I do a lot of the documentation. But the complete works, which has probably 80% of his papers are available. They're not in English, that you have to read Spanish or Latin. He wrote in Latin, but luckily for me, the Dominican priest translated his Latin works into Spanish. And copiously edited and annotated. In some instances, whole books. The first volume, I'll stop here. The first volume of the 14 volumes is actually a biography written by one of his Dominican brothers named Alvaro Huelga. So it's a whole biography. It's not just Las Casas paper. It's a beautiful biography. And it's a critical biography in the sense that he recognizes the warts, but he can see through to the kind of the foundational elements in his life that more than compensate for the warts. In 1550, because of Las Casas, the crown, Charles V, called a halt to the conquest. Well, that was a little bit disingenuous. I mean, the conquest of the Americas was basically done by 1550, but it sounds good. And he called for a debate to discuss the question, was the conquest of the Americas just and right, and is the crown's sovereignty and dominion over the Americas valid? And every other question rises up. The humanity of the American Indians, you know, their ability to develop political means to govern themselves, their social structure. Everything comes together, and a debate is called, and a commission is called together. And Las Casas is asked to give, the pro-Indian side. And the greatest Aristotelian scholar in all of Spain, a fellow trained at the University of Salamanca, Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, is to speak on the other side. Basically, I'm going to defend the Spanish, but in it he attacks the Indians as depraved, as second-class people. Look at Aristotle. Aristotle divided people into two kinds. But let's simplify Aristotle. I don't read Aristotle every night, I do the Tuscaloosa News or Reader's Digest or, my Kindle book. But I've read enough about Aristotle probably to talk, as well as anybody on it. And Aristotle, and I read this part, divided people into those who were born to govern and those who were born to be governed, to obey. And so, and Aristotle was a great source of secular wisdom. This other source of knowledge and wisdom in the 16th century was Scripture, revealed knowledge, and then the Greeks and the Romans. And so Aristotle was dragged out. He was dragged out by a Scottish Dominican as early as 1510. A guy named John Major, who was shooting his mouth off, and he'd never been to the Indies. He didn't know squat, but he was, one of these intellectuals. It never has stopped an intellectual from speaking with authority about anything. But Ginés de Sepúlveda used Aristotle, and at one time, whether it was at this time or later, I'll tell you a little bit about Las Casas. He was very cynical, sarcastic, and he did have somewhat of a sense of humor. And he was arguing against Sepúlveda, or arguing against Aristotle, and I think he was arguing before the Crown. And he says, and as far as using Aristotle, and he's dictating and talking to the leading Aristotelian in the country. It'd be like one of us, a lawyer, telling the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, let me tell you what's right and what's wrong here. He says, as far as Aristotle is concerned, that pagan is roasting in hell. I told Louise she's going to like the book. She's got a prophetic personality, and I'm at the receiving end of it sometimes. and as far as that pagan, he's roasting in hell. So don't keep looking back to Aristotle. Although Aristotle was foundational, and that was kind of a simplistic way of dealing with making his argument, making his point. And the debate was never answered. The question was never answered in its entirety. Las Casas, in his remarks before the committee, it sounds like me tonight, he read to them from something like a 600-page of defense of the American Indians, and he read to them for 8 straight hours. And they didn't call another committee meeting for another 2 years. and in the meantime, Sepúlveda answered the objections that Las Casas brought up, and then Las Casas got a hold of the objections that Sepúlveda had written, and he answers those again. And Sepúlveda finally threw his hands up. He said, let's move on. I'm not going to repeat myself like Las Casas does over and over and over and over again. And then the committee disbanded. They had other things to do. Many of the members were members of the Council of Trent, which was dealing with what are you going to do with these Protestants, and it was developing the counter-Catholic, counter-Reformation. And it just never, typical academic committee, didn't come to any conclusion. But it was debated, and the conquest was stop. Nobody can do anything right now until we finish. But the conquest was basically over, yeah. Well, you've been a very good audience. Thank you.